I think the time is upon us, so let us begin this session. Again, welcome everyone to the Project on American Justice Symposium session on emerging technologies. For those of you who weren't at the session just prior, I'm Chip Calderon. I'm a co-director at the CNA Center on Justice Research and Innovation, and a proud supporter of the Project on American Justice. I hope you'll permit me just a few thoughts and observations before we launch into the session and hear from our panelists. So just want to say this. In my opinion, and I think probably a number of people would share this, you can't really talk about the future of the justice system without talking about technology. And I was actually took part in a session a couple weeks ago where people who know better than I do the ins and outs of federal government finance and spending, they were talking about the next 10 or 20 years in government spending. And the message they were providing was that because of things like the debt load and other decisions being made now, discretionary spending in the government is going to shrink. So currently about 28% of the federal budget is discretionary. In the next 10 to 20 years, that's going to reduce to about 20%. That's what these people were talking about. I'm not an expert. I was listening intently. If they're right, brings to mind a couple things. Our work, those of us who apply for government funding, is going to get much more competitive over the next 10 years because there'll be a smaller pool to compete for. But the other thing they were talking about is that they felt that with that shrinkage, the government was going to focus more on spending on technology. That there is the belief that investing in technology brings efficiencies that are being lost in other ways. So I don't know if that's here or there, but I have that on my mind as we talk about these issues. I'm also going to say that you really can't talk about technology in the justice system without talking about advanced analytics, like artificial intelligence and machine learning, also about surveillance and cameras and other things. And that brings us very quickly into what I know of as digital evidence management. And a lot of developments taking place, emerging solutions to digital evidence management problems. So, not surprisingly, CNA has been involved in these matters in nearly all of our public sector work for the past 20 years. We have asked our three panelists to talk about artificial intelligence and technology in the justice system. We're going to ask them to talk about their work a little bit, things that they see going on, and where they think things are going. Our format for the session is going to be very much discussion oriented. I have several questions I'm going to ask that I provided to them in advance, and so I will randomly pick different members of our panel to ask these questions of, and they'll have a chance to reflect and provide their thinking and the benefit of their experience in these areas. We will have time at the end, as we have in other sessions, for some questions and answers. So please populate the chat with those questions or be prepared with them when we have about 15 minutes left in this session. I'll introduce our panelists briefly and then we'll get to work. So we have Bryce Peterson here. Bryce is a senior scientist in our Center for Justice Research and Innovation. He's done substantial work over the past decade in the evaluation of body-worn cameras and other emerging technologies in the justice system. He has a PhD in criminal justice from John Jay College. We have Vince Bauer. He is a research director in CNA's data science and predictive analytics team. PhD in political science from Stanford. We know Vince well because he worked jointly with us as a principal contributor to some work we did on predictive analytics and officer safety that you'll hear about very soon. So Vince, thank you for joining us. And we have Detective John Morgan from the Bergen County, New Jersey Prosecutor's Office. He specializes in technology, computer information systems, and has done a lot of work with body-worn cameras in Bergen County. He came to law enforcement actually from the private sector. He was involved in computer security and cybersecurity in the private sector before he came to law enforcement. And he brings to this panel, I'm going to suggest, a very special and important practitioner's perspective to all this. He has a master's in information system technology from the New Jersey Institute of Technology, a place that's near and dear to my heart because John and I happen to be Jersey boys. And so we kind of roamed the same haunts, although we didn't run into each other, I don't think. So anyway, John, thank you for being here, and thank you for the work you've participated in with us over the years and for bringing your perspective today. So let me start with kind of an easy question. I want to ask, I think I will start with Bryce on this, and Vince, I'll go to you, then to John. But just tell us about your work and how it has you involved in issues around technology and artificial intelligence, particularly as it relates to the justice system. If you can, add some details about a current project or initiative that you're involved in. So Bryce, I'll let you start us off.
Sure, thanks, Chip. I think, so I'm a researcher in the criminal justice system. My research kind of split between policing practices and correctional practices and technologies. And technology, like in every other sector of society, is ever present, right? And it's ever growing. I think it affects everything that's happening, in our daily lives, but the justice system is no different. So my work spans various types of technological applications. I've done some work on fixed surveillance systems, done quite a bit of work on body cameras, as you mentioned. A chunk of my portfolio of work focuses on contraband interdiction technologies that are used inside correctional facilities, which have a lot of overlap with technology and specifically with different types of artificial intelligence and different kinds of AI learning tools there. And so I'd say my work kind of spans and is all encompassed by this proliferation of technology. I'll give just a very quick snippet of a current project that we have that's focused on AI, and then I'll turn it over to my co-panelists. I'm happy to talk more about these as we move forward. So we're doing some work right now at CNA looking at how body camera data can be harnessed to improve officer accountability and transparency. So just as a very quick background, right now, body cameras produce a lot of digital evidence. They produce a lot of footage that's stored either on the cloud or on a server somewhere. The vast majority of that is never reviewed. It's not reviewed by supervisors. It's not reviewed by members of the general public. And so it kind of just sits there until eventually it's deleted. And that undermines a little bit the promise of body cameras to improve transparency and accountability, because we're not looking at most interactions occurring between officers and community members. And so there's different types of AI tools, which I'm sure we'll talk more about as this session goes on, that are harnessing AI to review body camera footage in a systematic way, in a proactive way, and provide metrics on officer behaviors, whether, for example, whether being courteous, professional, following departmental standards, introducing themselves, and a couple of different things in a way that's meant to, again, improve transparency and accountability. So doing it for every single interaction that officers have that's recorded by body camera, and then using that to kind of proactively manage officer behaviors. So that's something that we're working on here at CNA.
Great. Nicely done. Vince, please go ahead. Just something about your work, what you're involved in.
Thanks, Chip. Absolutely. And really glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation. As Chip mentioned, my day-to-day I work on the Navy side of CNA's business. So my team helps the Navy implement kind of the latest tools in machine learning and data science for enhancing their business practices, helping senior leaders with forecasting, kind of using the best available information to make their strategic decisions. And that's really rewarding work, but also sometimes, get the pleasure to work with JRI, Chip's team, others on the side of the research and justice side of the house. Recently, we completed a project where we used some of those same tools to look at topics around officer safety. I believe that was funded by NIJ. Really interesting research portfolio. I'm really glad to have been a part of it. The question there was around opportunities to mitigate harms to officer injuries, and those are thankfully really rare, but have a significant impact on the individuals they affect, on the organizations that are affected by those injuries. Traditional tools in analytics and data analysis are not super helpful for analyzing those relatively rare events, really hard for them to pick out what were the driving factors behind these injuries, what can we do to improve our practices to reduce the likelihood of these kind of events happening again in the future. And those are really situations where machine learning can be super helpful, identify these risk factors, identify, what was the causes behind these relatively rare events, and then design policies around mitigating those risk factors in the future. They're also really well suited to matching some of the agency's risk tolerances. We did a lot to work with agencies to understand what kind of errors they were willing to accept, in what areas did they really not want to accept any risk. So we could really target what the what our algorithms, what our prediction models were doing in order to get them the kind of forecast that they were most likely to incorporate into their practices. So it was really promising. I think we showed a lot of potential for this kind of work when offices are thinking about dispatch, when those kind of decisions are being made about what resources should be invested towards a particular call for service. I'm just really interested in kind of pursuing that and where we can go in that kind of analysis in the future.
Thank you, Vince. I don't think I don't think I'd hurt anybody's feelings by saying some of the most interesting and stimulating work that we do happens when we reach across and work with the military side of CNA and just have, really synthesis of ideas and approaches. So it's been a great experience, Vince. Thank you. All right, John, tell us about your work a little bit.
So the interesting thing about being here at the Bergen County Prosecutor's Office is technically we do policy and directive for the 70 departments within our jurisdiction as well. So as these new technologies, this AI, this body-worn camera comes out, we usually offer some sort of guidance or policy based on their usage. So in terms of what we've been working on, I'll get to BWC here in a moment. We've also been using artificial intelligence for transcription. And I will admit that the accuracy is in the upper 90 percentile at this point. It's come a long way. And more recently, we're looking at AI-assisted report writing to speed up the process of police reports, taking the reports in the field. And we're actually seeing some very positive feedback on it so far in terms of how easy it makes the detective's job. However, on us testing that, we're also issuing a compliance policy that's going to come out before they're actually allowed to use it. And I'll touch on that more as we talk, but policies are going to be key when using these artificial intelligence algorithms. So one of the first problems we ran into with BWC is we had a barricaded subject, 30 regional SWAT team members were on the scene, lasted 8 hours. That's 240 hours worth of video. Please find me a prosecutor that's going to sit there for 30 days, 8 hours a day and watch every video. It's not humanly possible. And if we talk about the digital evidence management side of it, that's 300 gigabytes I now have to store. God forbid it's a police involved shooting at the end of the barricade. I may have to store that for the next 90 years. So the whole idea behind the BWC artificial intelligence project we're working on is to identify critical spots, motions, events, things that should be bookmarked to bring attention to both the prosecutor and the defense attorney. So the way we're trying to sell it is we think it'd be valuable to both as a time saver to allow them to either they can sit there for 30 days and review, or they can jump to the critical spots they both really want to see to figure out how they resolve the case. In extension of that, and I know Bryce and I have talked about this in the past, there's a training and compliance perspective to all this BWC video as well. Here at the prosecutor's office, I think we've been up and running on DEM, digital evidence management, for about 1.5 years, closing in on 2 years now. And we're rapidly approaching 100 terabytes worth of body-worn camera video. There is no reason that someone can't run AI on the backside to identify policies, procedures, proper training, identify why one municipality may have a slightly higher use of force than all the others that would stand out. How can we use this to our benefit? Because that data is now all public record. The real question is, you have to remember AI is a tool. It can't be used to make decisions. It can only be used to guide you to the location where you can make those decisions. And I really think the data sets are getting to the point where AI is really going to have to start taking over from this point on.
All right. Nicely done, John. Thank you. 2 quick thoughts as we move on. Nice to hear from each of you about your work, because we couldn't talk about every aspect of AI and technology in 1 hour and 15 minutes. So we at least put some general parameters around what we're going to talk about today. That's number one. Number two, John, I think you provided a nice introduction to my next question. So I'm going to start with you on this one. And this is, talk a little bit more about what you see happening around you in your profession and your work regarding technology and artificial intelligence. And adding on to that, how is it affecting the people and the stakeholders that you work with? Not necessarily internal to your agency, but for the people around you and the stakeholders in your system.
It depends on which part of the AI technology you're referring to. The AI redaction has been a bane for a lot of my municipalities. They chose to go a different route than we did, and they now have a team of dedicated 4 to 5 detectives just to do redaction every day for the Oprah requests that are coming in. Our redaction in office is AI based. It's more streamlined. We're able to just identify 2 people that run the entire office. And that's because the AI is so user-friendly, it assists them in doing their jobs. In terms of transcription, it's allowed us to free up a lot of people that used to do English transcriptions. They're now assigned to different tasks in support of the mission. Transcription on the bad side doesn't work so great for foreign languages. So there's still a need for that to continue. Overall, I think it's a culture change. That's really what happened with the system here at BCPO. When COVID hit, we went virtual. We went completely cloud-based. We went 365 like everybody else. And we threw out digital evidence management at the same time. And when people are used to using those tools in the field, their phones, their tablets, and not having to come into the office, I think it's easier for them to embrace artificial intelligence and how it streamlines their job to come back and make things work out a little better at the end.
Great. Thank you, John. Bryce, can I toss that question to you?
Yeah, I think John summarized it very nicely, and he has, that kind of on the ground practitioner experience, how it's happening as agency. I think similar. I think the experience from agencies across the country again is going to vary. And John, you mentioned because you oversee so many different agencies, just the differences in your jurisdiction. And I think that's true on the national level too. I think some agencies are really embracing this and getting ahead of the curve, and you have some that are pushing back on it or dealing with challenges along the way. That's making it the bane of their existence, I think. So I think the impact varies and the reaction varies. And this is true of any technology, right? That's how it was with body cameras. You had some early adopters who had a lot of growing pains along the way, but a few years in had very robust body camera programs with policies in place, kind of knew what they were doing. And then you had some late adopters who dealt with those growing pains later and were sort of behind the curve. And so when there's inevitably something that happened in their jurisdiction, they didn't have body cameras in place, there's a lot of public scrutiny. I think we're going to see similar kind of challenges with some of the late adopters to some of these AI technologies, right? That if they don't have them in place, there's going to be a lot of questions raised about why they don't have them. I guess the moral of the story is I liken AI and technology as like a freight train that's coming, right? It's gonna come no matter what. And I think it's up to us as researchers, it's up to the practitioners, it's up to everyone to understand how best to implement it. John talked a lot about policies in place. I think that's obviously critical. And I think the people who are more proactive and willing to do that now are going to be better set up for the future because it is coming.
Yeah, thank you. So Vince, this might be an interesting take on this question from your experience on the military side. Maybe talk a little bit about what you see happening on that, in that realm, and who are your stakeholders and who are your clients and how are they being impacted by all this work?
Sure, absolutely. And from talking with you and your team, I see a lot of the same trends happening on the Navy side as I see with law enforcement agencies. Both the reliance and more consumption of data to help senior leaders kind of understand their organization, understand the operations, as opposed to relying on their guts and the kind of feeling about how policies are being implemented, responses from the community. Right, all of that can be better informed, more visibility for senior leaders based off of data that they're seeing from their organization. So I think a lot more understanding of what data collection, data visualization, even before going to things like artificial intelligence, just the kind of basic collection of daily operations by the organization, what visibility that creates for senior leaders into how those operations are going. Also a lot on kind of autonomy and the use of robotics. The Navy started up its first specialty in robotics warfare operator recently in the last couple of months. So they're really leaning heavily into the use of autonomous vehicles in their operations, right? They see that as a future where they can start to have where a lot of those more dangerous, dirty, dull tasks being operated by artificial intelligence, by robots, and know that there are a lot of similar conversations around those topics happening in law enforcement agencies as well.
Fascinating. That raises a bunch of questions in my head that maybe we can get to a little bit later in this conversation, but thank you for that. I'm going to ask a third question now. It's going to maybe dig a little bit deeper into this line of questioning in a slightly different way. Bryce, maybe I'll come back to you with this, but can you think of something particular that you're observing right now or working on that you haven't mentioned already? Something that's kind of there that would benefit from the integration of more advanced technologies or artificial intelligence. It's not necessarily being addressed.
Yeah, I think something that's happening in the field a little bit, but not in a very systematic way, that I'm seeing in some of the work I do. So some of the work that CNA does is focused on like local assessments. We work with local agencies, to identify, to understand their processes, their policies. We do staffing analyses, a bunch of different things. And one thing I've seen especially with smaller agencies, but this is true of bigger agencies too, is just their systems don't talk to each other oftentimes. And so it makes it very difficult sometimes for researchers, but also internal as practitioners to answer questions, right? So even just saying things like, here's how many ad incidents we have related to this kind of thing, it can be very difficult. I think AI has a lot of promise in better linking systems across each other. We see that a lot in other spaces. We don't see it as much right now in law enforcement, although there are technologies out there doing that. But I think doing this sort of integration between systems that aren't meant to talk to each other is a promising avenue out there. So if there's any vendors on the call, but I think that technology needs to be pushed. It's something that I've noticed that's just a challenge, a consistent challenge in justice agencies that I hope AI can do something to help solve.
All right, thank you, Bryce. Vince, I'm going to hand this one off to you now. That sounds to me a little bit like large language modeling work, and so I want to just see what your take is on that, or what you want to bring up in terms of what you're observing right now that we could lean into more with this kind of technology.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Bryce said, and I think a lot of those touch on points that John had earlier too about right, the use of artificial intelligence, large language models that take those transcripts, right, all that data that's being collected, body camera footage, even those, right, I think John talked about generating those reports from artificial intelligence, but even taking those reports and then that were written either by AI or by an officer themselves, and then turning those into usable data that can then be ingested into the rest of these systems, right? I think there's a lot of data being collected, in some form or other, images, sound, reports, right, PDFs, Word documents. There's a lot of collection going on, but turning it into something that is, and true for law enforcement agencies, true for the Navy as well. But the next step of taking that data and turn it into something that is clean enough that can be connected to other sources of data, because when we have these questions we're trying to help our sponsors with, right, they usually don't need data from one data source, right? They need to know how this factor influences that factor, right, what the inputs and what the outputs are. And usually that means we have to start combining different sources of data, and where outside help to an organization, a little bit more data expertise kind of help make that possible, where the organization isn't able to manage that complex data by itself. But I definitely think that that's kind of the big area where data needs to be improved, important investments to be made by agencies to make sure that they're when they're collecting data, that they can get the most value out of that and answer the questions that they want the answers to.
Okay, thank you. And John, from where you sit, I know you're doing a lot of work and a lot of applications. Where would you like to have the ability, assuming maybe an unlimited budget, to, do more applications and apply more of this technology to your work?
Unlimited budget would be fantastic. Kind of to play off what Bryce said, that has been a battle I have fought my entire career, is the interoperability battle, because it all stemmed from 9/11, the silos of information. How do we get the silos broken into? I did see somebody in chat mention Peregrine as a product that does do that kind of large data integration. I'm very familiar with it. I'll leave off on that one now. But before any kind of those platforms came out, we had our own internal interoperability directive that says any agency that purchases, upgrades, or changes their system must be compatible with us, and they must have an API, or they can't do business, period. And those are the kind of policies you needed to put into place to get that interoperability resolved, because I can tell you vendors will push back hard without that policy. And they'll try to charge ingress, egress fees for the Microsoft Cloud. There's a lot of complications in there, but it can be resolved with policy. And now we play nice with our vendors. To get back to the question you asked me, it is sorting through and managing the volumes of data. Some people on this call probably won't even know what I'm talking about, but my data range is in the 4 petabyte range. That's how much data we're dealing with. That's more than a human being can sort through in pretty much their career. That being said, keep in mind, the average cell phone now is averaging 256 gigabytes to 1 terabyte. How many phone dumps do you have in a year? Who can sit there and actually go through that phone data and accurately report all the information and all the connections of how it comes back? Not to mention identify photos of interest or other critical information. Plus, everyone talks through text message today or digital communication platforms. You have to go through all the data. You have to find all of that, for lack of better words, needle in the haystack. I think that's really where you're going to need to apply that advanced technology, the AI, to get it working better, just to sort through the sheer amounts of data that we're currently collecting. And we have to collect and store for the statutory requirements.
All right. I'm gonna just take a quick pause here and just mention something. I very much appreciate discussion. I appreciate your responsiveness to my questions. It's going very, very well. I'm going to take a slightly different tack now, and I think, John, I'm going to come back to you with this one. This gets more towards the responsible use and the ethics of this kind of technology. Do you have concerns about the way things are developing with emerging or advanced technologies in the justice system?
My biggest concerns are usually the human component. Just because I already saw it, there was the example, I believe it was in New York, the defense attorney got all of his case law from ChatGPT and got in a little bit of trouble for it. I've caught other people using ChatGPT and had comments with them. My real concern is, we have to train these patrol officers that they can't copy and paste somebody's information from CJIS or another government system and paste it into one of these public-facing systems. Otherwise, it's going to become permanent record in the AI. It's kind of like posting something on the internet. Once it's out there permanently. Good luck taking it down. Privacy is going to be a huge concern with people just because of the sheer amount of data that AI can mine through and connect in a short period of time. And a lot of that is it's about training good police recruits to recognize that this information is very powerful. It cannot be abused. You have the respect to privacy. And everything that is said and out there is going to be searchable in these ChatGPT models. Somebody tested it out. They ran my name through it. Fortunately, it didn't find too much, but I definitely came up and it knew places I had worked before. So I think a lot of that can be addressed with policy, procedure, training. I did have a note here. One of the most important things is going to be having a transparency message to your public. What are you going to provide the public to prove to them that you are properly using this information? For ALPR, we do audits by agency and post the results every year to try and ensure the public that we're properly using ALPR technologies. I would suspect we're going to have to do something very similar with AI in the not so distant future. I would like to say that freight train Bryce was referring to has already arrived.
All right, John, thank you. Bryce, can I hand this off to you and maybe ask you to think a little bit about the work you do in corrections, and if there's any concerns that come to your mind about how this technology is being applied?
Yeah, so I was thinking about it when John said it. I'll talk generally about the justice system as we talk. Maybe I'll have a specific corrections example, but I think like the buckets of issues with the technology coming down are certainly the human component, right? So even if technology is perfect, how are people using it? Those policies in place need to like guide how people are using it. I think there's obviously some concerns about the technology itself too, right? You have this stuff is being rapidly developed with a lot of promise from a lot of vendors. And I don't think that that promise always lives up to expectations. I think down the road, we're going to see a lot of these become a lot better developed, a lot more effective. But I think there's a lot of promises being made right now and not enough evidence to show that those promises are legit. And that's a concern I have. I can say, for example, with corrections, there we go, Chip. When I started doing work on contraband interdiction technologies, almost a decade ago, the future was being predicted that drones were going to be the next big thing with contraband introduction to facilities. That drones were going to drop off contraband. At the time, I didn't know if that was really true or not. And we have seen over the years that in certain states and certain facilities that is a big issue. And so, of course, to combat that, there's a number of different technologies now that are meant to interdict drones, right? And they use some version of AI and different kinds of technologies. So whether it's acoustic sensors, whether it's RF detection, and if you go to any one of those vendors, they will say that theirs is the best. But when you look at actual studies or anecdotes from agencies about how effective those are, it ranges very widely, and it's hard to even tell how effective they are. And so I think that the actual efficacy of these technologies is a concern of mine. And then I would just say the third bucket of concerns is what this means for kind of other aspects, right? So it's not just policy. So just as an example, we're producing a lot more information, a lot more evidence, and a lot more data. And in states, especially states that have, this has been an issue, for example, in many Florida agencies, states that have these sunshine laws or, open public records requests, this can create a huge new burden on staff within justice agencies, right? So we're talking about transcribing all body camera footage. Are those transcriptions now available to public records request? Who handles that if that's within a police department? How is redaction going to occur there? I think there's some kind of ancillary concerns that haven't been fully thought through yet and that we're still trying to understand. So yeah, that's how I'd answer your question. I think there's a lot of concerns, a lot of promise, but a lot of concerns from different angles.
Ain't that the way it always is? Thank you, Bryce. Vincent, what concerns are coming up in your world as this, technology advances? Right, there you go.
There we go. Got the unmute to work. Yeah, it was super interesting to hear, from Bryce and John, because I think the themes are very similar across the kind of work areas. Right. I think my main concern there is, again, the human factor of understanding, what are these tools capable of, both in their kind of, particular iterations of a tool, particular vendor, particular set of software, but then even just the general category of what could an LLM, even the best version of it, what is it ever going to be capable of doing? And understanding that those tools are language models, right? They're not decision models. They're not content models. They can generate sentences that seem very plausible at the top level, but that doesn't mean that they are going through the logical process that a human being would to reach that same decision. Or we're sometimes asked to help the Navy evaluate requests from different vendors, promises about what their tools can yield, and right, there's a lot of promises about these tools being able to make decisions for decision makers, to come to decisions, to to generate truths that the decision makers can use in their as they're making decisions, forecasts out into the future, right? Understanding the limitations of these systems, what they're doing, and how they reflect the historical patterns, right? We hear a lot of concerns about, bias in machine learning and artificial intelligence, and understanding where those concerns are valid, where there, maybe improvements over human decision making is important. But right, particularly when those systems are then based off of historical data, right? There's a lot of very valid concerns about fairness in terms of, yes, this model is performing as it's supposed to be performing, the math works, the system delivers what it's supposed to deliver, but it's delivering you the past and the decisions that human beings made in the past that may have, included bias for a variety of reasons in how those decisions were implemented. So making sure that we're not giving those systems too much credit and making those decisions for human beings, understanding how they came to their decisions, what the basis was for how that was developed, so that we can keep them in check and make sure that there's that human in the loop that is ultimately the person making the decisions, as opposed to repeating human decisions from the past.
Very good. Thank you. All right. So we have two more questions left. I'm going to go to the next question, with each of our panelists. I think I'll save the last question for last, because we have a number of questions that have come through the chat that I want to make sure we get to. So I'm going to ask one question. This is the question that looks much further down the road at these technologies. And then we'll take some of the audience questions. Then I'll come back to each of you for a final thought that you have on what we should be thinking about as we go forward. But Vince, I'm going to come back to you on this one, because you started to take us down that path earlier when you were talking about robotics. And so the question is, looking further down the road, what's going to happen in the next 10 to 15 years? And what do you think those impacts will be, good or bad? And so I think we're not going to wait 10 to 15 years for robotics, because they're here. And then, when I think about the military working on unmanned systems, that have lethal weapons on them, it's not a leap. And having autonomous decisions being made about what to do with that. It's not a giant leap to think about a law enforcement drone having a weapon on it. And so just talk a little bit about what you see long-term, if you can. And, again, positive or possibly negative impacts down the road.
Yeah, thanks, Chip. No, I think that's a great question. And hopefully I have something to contribute there on, because I think that, the idea of, when we think about robotics and autonomous vehicles, we're talking about the military, we're talking about law enforcement agencies, right? We go to those killer robots, and I think that's kind of the worst vision of the future that we picture. I think I kind of see it the opposite, right? That we, especially thinking about the work that we did on officer safety, right? There's a lot of the kind of challenges we run into with the military law enforcement, right? It's that concern, it's driven by that concern for human safety, right? For the officer and the service personnel. And what robots are great at is that we don't have to worry about their safety, right? They can do the jobs that are, dirty, dull, and dangerous. And that, but I see a lot of potential with robotics to, certainly, potential for them to be misused. Right? If we know there's a situation that's dangerous, right, if we have to respond to it with service personnel, with officers, we'd have to take a lot of precautions for their safety. That might move some of that risk from the officer to the person who is being interacted with. But once we're involving a robot, right, we don't have to be nearly as concerned for its safety, right? I think there's more risk that we're willing to take to those systems that we're not willing to take to human beings. So I think it actually creates more opportunity to de-escalate those situations, to try to come to a resolution that doesn't put risk on officers, on service personnel. So I see a lot of kind of potential there where, right, we're talking about law enforcement agencies, we're talking about interactions between foreign militaries, a lot of potential for de-escalation through robotics, because we're taking that human being out of that piece of the process. Yeah, so I see as mostly good, right? Some of it is, certainly more neutral, right? The different questions about kind of surveillance. What does it mean to have, greater, presence of law enforcement that's now enabled through autonomous vehicles? I think that's more of a societal question on kind of the balance between safety and having that presence there versus questions about individual privacy. So kind of a whole spectrum of implications, which I think are all we're going to be moving towards in the future, whether we like it or not. But as a whole, I see a lot of potential there for benefits from these kind of systems.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to follow up with a question that may display some of my ignorance about things, but I'm going to do it anyway. Does studying and assessing the impact and the efficacy of robotics change your approach to data analysis or the data that you work with at all? Or is it all just data and algorithms and it doesn't make much difference?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the kind of high level decision, it doesn't make much of a difference where it comes from. There's some, you of course have to think about where the data came from and how it was collected. So there's some ways where, robotics adds additional, right? It can kind of increase the scope of what's being collected, right? Increases the amount of data you have to work with. It maybe is more objective in some ways because we know exactly, what the procedures are for measuring it, but you also never have it's a very kind of raw calculation of what the data is as opposed to the human being who could add their own subjective judgment about, this was a high risk call, this was dangerous, this wasn't dangerous, versus the kind of, more automated system isn't able to provide that subjective judgment. And often that's really what you care about when you're trying to think about your decision is some additional context that you couldn't measure from a sensor, from a robot, from some other autonomous way of generating data. So the kind of scope and breadth of what they can collect is, certainly much larger than we could hope to get through human beings without some, massive workforce that is spending all their time doing data entry for us to analyze the results of. But also, can miss some of those, critical details where we really do need a person there to observe what's going on and to report back on that human piece of the puzzle as well.
Good. Thoughtful answer. Thank you. Bryce, where does your mind go when you think about impacts over the next 10 or 15 years?
I think it's such a hard question to answer. Both because I think and like Vince was hitting the nail on the head, I think, in terms of, there's always this balance and like what we think of, improving efficiency and efficacy of a system and balancing that with all the possible net negatives, right? And I think that was true with body cameras as a technology. I think it's true with every technology. It's certainly true with AI. So it's, I like to think of it, and also like what our perceptions of what's acceptable and good now may be different in 10 to 15 years as we get used to certain things. Maybe we're more comfortable with the idea of facial recognition being used, for example, on body cameras and automatically flagging people who have warrants. Maybe not, maybe so. That seems like a scary kind of application of it, but certainly something that in 10 to 15 years could be widely available and utilized. So I would like to think that in 10 to 15 years, with all of us concerned about this issue, researchers, practitioners, thought leaders, stakeholders, policymakers, that with enough collective energy towards this, that we can see a net positive, right? And that there's a lot of potential areas we can go. And so rather than thinking of like the specific technologies that we'll see in 10 to 15 years, I think thinking of the kinds of outcomes we want is a useful way to approach this, right? So in policing and in corrections, I think we talk about what our big objectives are, right? So transparency, accountability, and then to some extent efficiency, right? And efficiency shouldn't outweigh those other things. But if we think about those and how we can get there, I think that's valuable. And for example, with some of these AI talks, I hope that AI can be used to assess body cameras in a systematic way. And that gets us to this idea of accountability and transparency, because now we're looking at everything, right? We're not just selectively picking certain footage. We're not just picking body camera footage when an officer misbehaves or a community member misbehaves. Instead, we're looking at the whole spectrum of interactions and having a more accountable, transparent system. I think about, we talked a little earlier about like data integration, and we're seeing this movement among most large police departments to be more transparent with data, right? Most of them have like open data portals. They're posting data online. I think of how that can be expanded with the use of AI, right? Because the systems can now be automated in a better way. So we're not not using a person's time in the department to, a dedicated person to extract, clean, and put all these data in a timely manner. But now we can kind of automate those processes, and we can see things like that we don't currently see: use of force incidents by jurisdiction, or typically what you see in these open data portals is like crime incidents. Sometimes you see arrests and some other measures. But I think we can see more and more of these kinds of big data questions that we want answered as a society, done in a more systematic and open way. So I tend to be optimistic about things. I think with all of us talking about these issues now and over the next 10 years, I would like to hope that we'll see, you know, a net positive of AI and its impact on the justice system.
Great. What a good answer, Bryce. John, I'm going to turn to you. Again, thinking 10 to 15 years down the road, what do you see and what impacts are you envisioning in all
I
this?
think in terms of the robotics and the drones, I think policy and case law is going to guide us down that path. It's kind of like the difference between a public roadway versus a driveway. You can't exactly fly a drone over somebody's fence and then charge them with what they find. Were you lawfully there in the first place? And as that case law comes out, I think it's going to guide us. It may be a couple years behind the times, so we may get some bad news articles out there, but I think it will probably direct us in the right path. One of the benefits I do see now with the drones that I expect to be more widespread is I have jurisdictions here in Bergen County that when you call 911 and they have a situation, the drone flies on scene before the officer arrives.
Yeah.
So the officer has situational awareness and safety of what they're walking into. God forbid it's an active shooter situation similar to what just was in the news. The drone will know first and they can send the resources necessary to hopefully negate the threat. 10 to 15 years out, I'm not sure the robotics and stuff is going to get there quite so much for law enforcement. I've seen a lot of cool tech out there, but it inconveniences us in terms of what we have to do in the field as well. The one thing I could definitely see is every officer having some sort of personal digital assistant or personal AI that maybe rides along with them so that when they need to run somebody's information, run it through one of these AI databases, they request their AI to do it and it's delivered immediately back to the officer, which means they can do it in the field. They don't have to be in front of a laptop or attached to their car. It basically unifies the system for real-time intelligence and information sharing. And there is a vendor that currently does something like this, where if an officer is in trouble, they touch their body-worn camera, it live streams to everyone who needs to know it and backups en route. So we are getting there. 10 to 15 on the bad side, I think it's mostly going to be probably on cybersecurity. They're already using AI to test cybersecurity defenses. It's a constant threat. AI is being used to write malware and viruses that are polymorphic and getting better with every day. And just think about what's going to happen when people continue to manipulate and poison the publicly accessible chat GPTs or whatever they might be. I'm just using that as an example. And what information will they be able to extract? You know, I ran something through Gemini yesterday and it told me how to write the code from scratch. It was actually terrifying, but it worked. So I want to say in 10 to 15 years, a lot of those bias we talked about will hopefully be resolved. Where I've seen the bias with the body-worn camera is the problem is the machine. You have to think about how you would ask DALL-E to generate the same photograph that you have to describe to the court. The difference is you would never describe the photograph to the court in that manner. And that's where the bias is coming from, is the machine is just cold calculating and to the point. And I think that's going to be ironed out over the next 10 to 15 years.
All right. Thank you all very much. I'm gonna say one quick thing, and I hope you'll indulge me in this for a second, and then we're gonna go to some audience-generated questions. I was texting one of my colleagues as you were responding to these questions, and my comment to them was, we have the smartest people on the planet here, and I'm very sincere about that. Just enjoy listening to your thoughtful responses to all these prompts. Now we're going to put you on the spot and give you some unscripted questions that have come up. And fair warning, John, I'm going to start with you. They have taken two themes that I can see. One is actually more about evaluability issues and how we know this stuff is working well. And the other is going to take us back to some fairness issues, which I'm anxious to get into. But it's actually a pretty straightforward question. How do you know if your AI is working, and how should agencies evaluate their AI outcomes? So, John, how do you respond to that? And we'll go to Bryce and Vince on the evaluation question. How do you know if it's working well?
That's actually a very great question. The short answer is the humans have to evaluate it. The humans have to sit there, verify the data, run the model. Model looks good, run it for a few months, reevaluate, run it again. You have to keep in mind with AI, one model does not fit all. And I reiterate that to people that an AI model generated here in New Jersey for how police do traffic stops isn't going to apply to a Midwest town. How you interact, what your civilians are like, it could be completely different. And it's a continuous reevaluation process. Again, AI is just a tool. It's up to the humans to make sure that it's doing its job properly. And if it's not, stop it, reevaluate it, and start over.
Okay. Thank you, John. Bryce, what's your magic
Yeah,
answer?
there's so many different ways to answer this question. It really, like John said, depends on the technology, depends on the department. So with some of the things we've been talking about, so with this tools that are meant to process body camera footage, which I've been mostly talking about, there's two different answers to that, right? So the one is the technology working the way it's supposed to be working? And so if you have it simply transcribing body camera footage, you have to make sure that the transcriptions are accurate, right? It's not confusing the words. So that's one component. The second is in the technology I'm talking about, it takes those transcriptions and then develops some sort of metrics, like let's say it's officer professionalism, use of profanity, those kinds of things. Those are sentiment analyses, not just is a text this text. It's talking more generally about the sentiment of the conversation. So you have to validate that, right? Is that working the way it's supposed to be working? Are those metrics, again, as John said, is the human element. Would humans agree with what this AI is producing? But I think as a researcher, then the next step to all of that is, so what? So if let's say it's doing exactly what it's producing, it's perfect or 90+% accurate in transcriptions. It's producing these metrics that most people would agree with. What does that mean though? Is it actually changing behavior? Is it being used by supervisors in the field? Does it have an impact beyond that? Because I think if the answer is no to that, then as accurate as the technology is, it's useless, right? The whole point of these technologies in the justice system is that they need to produce some sort of measurable change. And that measurable change is going to depend on the technology. So in what I'm talking about, we would expect to see officers generally behaving more professionally. We would expect to see maybe a combination of commendations going up for good behavior, but also reprimands going up for bad behavior. And then ultimately, if that doesn't translate into fewer uses of force incidents or fewer at least unjustified uses of force incidents, more stronger police community relations, if that's not happening for that specific technology, then again, I don't know if the juice is worth the squeeze, right? And then again, you have to do that for every single technology, understand what the it is, if it's working the way it's supposed to be working, and then what the intended impact is too.
Very nice. And Vince, what does evaluation look like in your world?
Yeah, I agree with everything that John and Bryce said. I think it really starts to get tricky when your goal is to eliminate human biases, because you always have to balance that AI's output against the output that you have from a human, right? As Bryce talked about, right? If we're talking about transcribing, right? We have a pretty good sense of when the machine is doing that well. When we're talking about sentiment analysis or how risky was this call for service, right? We have good reason to think that we're running into circumstances where we're trying to remove that human element from the equation so that we can get away from biases, get away from human being cued by information that we don't want it to be cued by. And we're relying on the machine because we can be very specific about, I want you just to look at the probability that an officer is hurt. I don't want you to, take in, your 50 years of experience of working in this area, because circumstances have changed. There's additional factors that get queued up that we don't want to be queued up. There's certainly in those situations where we're trying to do something that the human being is entering a piece into the equation that we don't want to, it gets super challenging.
Good, thank you. All right. Next question, again, gets kind of more at a fairness issue. I don't have anyone particular that I want to direct this to, so I'll let someone maybe just volunteer. But this comes from one of our analysts, and I like the nature of the question. It goes something like this. We know that agencies have varying capacities to implement new technologies and leverage the data that they have. So as these technologies and this methodologies continue to advance, do we anticipate larger gaps and disparities between technology-driven agencies and smaller agencies with limited capacity? And so maybe lingering behind that is a bigger question about, right, the technology divide or something like that. And I really haven't thought about that much. So anybody have a thought about that?
I am muted here. I was actually going to bring it up as my last point. Artificial intelligence is cost prohibitive. I would say probably 60% of agencies are really going to struggle to adopt what's currently out there. Even the digital evidence management platform is usually in the millions of dollars for something worthwhile that has the capabilities that really streamline your work and make your job easier. For the smaller departments, I would say, like for lack of a better word, start small. Adopt AI where you can, because there are some less expensive, maybe some open source models out there that you can download and run yourself. Reach out to your research partners, reach out to your academia. Maybe they can work with you to get that grant to get you up and running. One of the main things we're doing with our BWC AI project is one of our goals is to make it scalable. Because we came to the conclusion that it's great if we can identify all these things in the body-worn cameras, but if I can't scale it down to my smallest department, it's worthless. Our requirement is to be able to put it on a cell phone at the end of the day. So I know that's a big jump, but we definitely get the cost divide, and especially if governments continue to cut costs. I know we have a 2% cap here in New Jersey. Maintaining this stuff year to year is becoming very challenging. And fortunately, I come from a county that's able to equip us with that stuff.
Okay. Bryce or Vince, any reactions to that question?
Yeah, I see, this is also certainly, challenging to implement for its own reasons, but one of the nice things about technology is that it's usually scalable at kind of infinite horizons. Right. So, certainly a lot of kind of logistical challenges, but if there are opportunities for agencies to work together so that maybe it's not feasible for an individual agency to purchase some of these systems that John was talking about, and if a whole collection of agencies could get together and decide to purchase it together, right, their systems would have to be intercompatible so that they could all feed into it, they could all pull out of it. I'm sure there are additional kind of legal and oversight pieces of the puzzle will make it challenging as well. But there may be opportunities where everyone's individual piece of that suddenly becomes a lot more manageable. But then you're working across agencies and you're having to make sure that your systems are intercompatible with each other, which is certainly a kind of huge logistical burden. But there may be some opportunities there to kind of join together and take advantage of these. But certainly no small feat.
No, thank you. Bryce, anything to add?
Yeah, just a couple thoughts building off of what John and Vincent already said. So I think the answer to your question is yes. There will certainly be a technology divide, but I think that's already true. I mean, you already see it with smaller, less resourced agencies have less technology than larger agencies. And so in a response to that, there's kind of a couple areas I think I could talk about. One is that's where I think that's okay in some cases too, right? Like I think a much larger agency is going to need technology in a different way, and certainly AI, than a smaller agency, right? At least for some of the technologies we're talking about. Again, I'll go back to this kind of body camera processing thing, right? If you have 2 part-time deputies and a chief of police, having an AI system in place where you are, automatically processing every body camera footage that comes through, maybe not is not as important as an agency that has 1,500, patrol officers, 100 supervisors, a whole command staff, et cetera, right? So it's just different needs. And I think it's okay that those needs are different and that the technology is different. At the same time, I think that the better resource agencies, and we've seen this already, right? Like they are the ones who try out, develop these technologies, and that's what helps them get scaled appropriately for other agencies. So once we find out more about how they're used, whether they're effective, whatever effective means, we talked about evaluation already, but once we learn all those things, I think then it can be transferred down to even smaller agencies that need them. And a way that happens is, one, technology over time generally gets cheaper. So that's a positive. But I think also then that's when you have some entities step in. So John mentioned reaching out to research partners. Vincent talked about collaborating with other agencies. Those are all great approaches. BJA as a funder, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, right? Part of their work is to identify promising or effective technologies, and then they provide funding and oftentimes target smaller agencies to do that. We saw that with body cameras. Once some of those initial studies came out showing their efficacy. You know, there was funding specifically put into equipping smaller agencies with body cameras who maybe didn't have the capital up front to do it. So I think there's different ways we'll get there. I do think there will be a technology divide in the beginning, but once we learn about what those really effective approaches are, I think there'll be opportunities for even smaller, less resource agencies to jump on the train.
Great, great. Thank you all very much. We're down to our last 15 minutes, so we're going to do a couple things here. There's another question that came in the chat that again has a different kind of an orientation to it. So and I don't know who to send this to, so I'll just read it and see who wants to chime in. And I'll give everybody a chance for a final word or two. And then, you know, we'll see what our time looks like. So here's the question. Do the panelists see applications and use of artificial intelligence by the community that may influence the operations and work of the justice system? And John, you're my favorite go-to guy on this. How do you respond to that kind of a question?
The public already is. Look at the Ring doorbells. The Ring doorbells, you can sign up to assist in the criminal justice system. You can tell us that you're willing to share it if there's a crime in front of your house and have like an opt-in period where we can't actually view your camera, but we can come knock on your door if you record stuff. I think that the general public, in terms of their devices, they're all AI enabled already. I woke up the other day and found out that my Android had Gemini on it, even though I didn't want it. So one way or another, we're all getting enrolled. I think the public is going to play a key role in the artificial intelligence and actually feeding the systems that help with policing. To the same context, I could see the public demanding access to the records that the AI produces on what was run through it. We want copies or Oprah records of the searches or the data contained within. That's all part of that transparency part we keep talking about.
Thank you, John. Vince, how do you respond to that kind of a question?
Yeah, so I can't speak to the kind of, you know, community part of the question as well, but at least looking at the kind of military side of things, I see, right, service members for their personal lives are used to, you know, technology that functions in a particular way, right, that is easily accessible, that they're, you know, using AI tools in their day-to-day lives. And then they get to their work lives and they're still working on computers from the 80s, and right, they get really frustrated by the systems and the tools that are available to them. So I see kind of a lot of, you know, push, you know, from service members to their organizations to kind of accelerate digital transformation, and that, you know, the kind of, you know, a lot of the tools and investments that, you know, have or haven't been made over the last couple of decades in you know, technology writ large on the government side haven't been sufficient, and right, that disconnect is growing over time. So, and you know, it's frustrating for the folks who are expected to use these systems and are used to, you know, very streamlined processes as, you know, as they work through in their personal lives. So certainly see pressure from, you know, I see the potential that you know, maybe it's from, you know, law enforcement officers kind of giving that feedback back to their agencies about, you know, hey, I could do this easily on my cell phone. Why do I have to use this clunky, you know, huge computer that is slow and, you know, doesn't work well, and the data system is not user friendly, and right, I have to do all these things that I wouldn't accept in my personal life. So I see potential there for them to be driving agencies to kind of invest and make those modernizations.
Great, thank you. And Bryce, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'll add one small example, just what I can think of or what's already happening or starting to happen with community members using some form of AI. So you see, for example, there's many different websites, and I'm going to not try to name them all right now, but there's different websites that, for example, try to keep track of officer-involved shootings across the country, right, and collate that information, because it's not something that's tracked currently in a very good way by the federal government or any specific research database. So there's these independent organizations, newspaper organizations, and then private citizens who track these kinds of things. I think they have the potential to harness AI to track more things like that, right? So instead of just officer-involved shootings, which are relatively rare events, going to track other kinds of things that are happening either in policing, corrections, which is a whole nother conversation, which is largely ignored from the public discourse around transparency. Tends to focus on policing when, you know, what happens in corrections is potentially more problematic. It's behind closed doors, people are incarcerated. There's a lot of issues that go along there. And I think those kinds of uses of like data scraping from newspaper articles, press releases from departments of corrections or police agencies, whatever you're examining, I think there's some really basic uses of AI that can be used to help with this kind of accountability transparency issue.
Great. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I do want to note that our friend and colleague, Elliot Harkeby, posted something in the chat about a small agency that's making seemingly good use of artificial intelligence. So thank you for that, Elliot. Probably something that we should take a look at. Wonderful little comment from Kim Dine here. He loves the session to the point that his head hurts. So I think we've done our job. So let's take a couple minutes. If there's something that you have been dealing with or thinking about that we haven't touched on, or something that came to mind during this session that you want to leave our audience with, you have an opportunity. John, I'll start with you first, because you said that you already delivered your final comment. So if you want to pass this on to Vince or Bryce, that's fine. But if you have any final thoughts, we'd love to hear them.
I'm going to pass it on to Vincent. I just wanted to piggyback off of what he said. I can't tell you how often I get the comment of, if I can do it on my phone, why can't I do it in the office? And we saw that with CGIS. CGIS, for a long time, you had a specific computer you had to go to. It had to be used inside the department. We are all now mobile per CGIS FBI guidelines. Then it was our RMS system needs to be accessible. Then this system needs to be accessible. The change in the generational gap is definitely pushing technology to catch up to date in law enforcement. Vincent, it's all yours.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it. No, I just have a selfish comment, because I know we have a lot of practitioners on the line. Right. I think often, CNA, gets called in when, agency leaders have a, big important question they want to answer, right? There's been officer involved shooting. There's been other challenges at their agency. And then, right, it's at that moment when the agency, looks around, they, look for external help. They and want someone to come in and help them answer their question. And it's only then that, right, data starts to become our priority, right? We understand, what does the data help us to, make better decisions and help us understand if our investments have been successful. But at that point, it's really challenging, because, right, we're just starting to collect data today, right? We don't have that historical data to look back on. Right. So the more we can do to, have that data collection, going on even before there's a problem, before we know what question we want to use it to answer, that makes our lives a lot easier when we, when there's some, question that an agency wants to answer, and means that, right, agencies can get a much more satisfactory, answer to their question, as opposed to, well, the data is not really there, so here's some recommendations on how you can, collect data for the future.
Great. Vince, thank you. And Bryce, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think this is in the same vein as what's already been said. And I know I've said this already too, but this is what's been on my mind when we talk about this, right? This technology is coming, and we can either choose to stay ahead of it. We could choose to adapt to it and try to understand it and develop a system around it that implements it in the best, most effective, and most ethical way possible, or we can be left behind, right? And I think it's going to, like, we see this with everything. And so I think Vince said this, John said this, we need to just be adaptable as a society. I think every one of us plays a role. So we as researchers need to be embracing this challenge, understanding what it means to be part of a research project that involves AI, whether we're using AI ourselves, whether we're evaluating AI, what does an evaluation mean, whether you're practitioners and you have the opportunity to try out or develop AI tools. I think it behooves us all to, when we talk about that 10 to 15 years from now, if we want to see certain goals achieved, then we need to be thinking about them now, and we need to be ahead of the game now. I know that's beating a dead horse when we're talking about AI, because this is what everyone's concerned about. But I think it definitely affects the justice system just as much as it does every other sector of society. So that would be my, words of encouragement or final thoughts.
All right, thank you. I'm going to ask you to indulge me on one other question. We have a few minutes left, and I see Elliot has posted a question as well in the chat, so we'll see if we have time for that. But John, you said something early on that triggered something in my head that I've been thinking about, and that we've been talking about a little bit internally here. And the thing that you said was that AI has become user-friendly. And so I really like that. We've had some conversations internally here about how people talk about the black box of artificial intelligence, and that there's, you know, users and practitioners can't really understand it, and that's creating something of a divide in and of itself. And my experience has been that when we do this work and when we present it to practitioners, they tend to get it, and they tend to ask very intelligent questions based on what they see from us. And so they don't have to be PhD mathematicians, but maybe this stuff is more accessible and more readily understandable and able to be integrated than people give it credit for. So what do you, I mean, how do you react to that? And I'll go to Vince and Bryce maybe for a minute on that question.
So a lot of these are based on different tools that are now being put together to come together into what we know as the AI system. I'll give you an example of a tool I use with my kids all the time, Google Lens. Hey, Daddy, what is that? Snap a picture. I've got Wikipedia and a dozen National Geographic sites on my phone in seconds. It's no different than typing the same question in Gemini. The difference is it's searching by pictures instead. That is extremely user-friendly. When I used to do counterterrorism for Passaic County, you know, I would be in situations where I was in areas where the language I did not understand. I couldn't read it. I didn't know how to speak it. I used automatic translation and I was able to get by. You know, these, again, go back to my original statement. These are tools, but they're tools that are developed very well and easy to use that make the investigator or law enforcement officer's job easier. They just have to respect where those tools come from and how the data might be used. But they really can assist you in having a broader relationship with the community. Because before you may have had that barrier you didn't realize. This allowed you to overcome that barrier, and now you're able to be a better investigator for it.
All right, thank you. Vince?
Yeah, I think you know, certainly a lot of improvement in looking into that black box for the kind of traditional machine learning tools, but it took decades to get there for those tools to, you know, to figure out how do we display these results in a way that you can understand if you're not kind of working through the you know, the details of the math behind it. I think right for these AI, LLM tools, all these other large mixture models, I think we still have a lot of, they're so big, they're so complex, and they're still so new that I think there's still kind of a lot of investment that needs to happen to help make sure that, you know, we can understand how it's arriving at its decision, you know, what inputs were used. Right, it's already getting a lot better, right? I think, you know, when ChatGPT first came out, but it wasn't, you know, really possible to ask it to, you know, source its information. I know some of the new tools will give you, you know, sources that, you know, you can look back to you know, help verify the information, and it's not exactly the information that it used to generate that answer, but it's at least kind of a step in the right direction and kind of helps you do that, you know, due diligence as a person. So I think, you know, we can understand kind of high level what they're doing. The details of exactly how it came to that conclusion are just going to be, you know, really challenging because of all the you know, quantities of data they're ingesting to and the amount of math that they're doing to get to that result. But you know, give it 5, 10, 15 years, I think we'll come up with a lot of creative ways to get past that.
Okay. Thoughts, Bryce? We're going to wrap it up in a minute, but
I have very little to add to that. I thought Vince and John summarized it perfectly. I would just emphasize something that Vince was saying, which is that for some of these things, we do need to know how those conclusions arrived. It's less important, I think, you know, when we're talking about making decisions, is something we haven't talked a lot about, but AI is often used to make important decisions, right? So we talk about classification tools in correctional settings, determining which prison someone's going to, which housing unit they're going to, those kinds of things. If there's the potential for bias to be introduced there, I know it's a theme that we've talked about before on this call, but we do need to understand how those decisions are arriving. And, you know, if it's a really complicated mathematical model behind the black box, we still need to know, because we need to understand what's influencing these decisions and not just, you know, accepting, hey, these look right to me, these are working based on our evaluation, but we still do need to know what's happening behind the scenes. So as that is developing, just something we all should be aware of, I think.
okay. wonderful session. I hope this was a wise use of people's time. I'm going to take the last 20 seconds that I have, and on behalf of Vivian and the team that put this together, not only thank our panelists here who have offered some very valuable and thoughtful insights, but everybody who has been with us along the way in this symposium today and with our project and with the work that we do at CNA generally. We're very grateful for your interest and your participation. So I see we're back in the main session. Vivian, we got something that we're going to close up with?
Yeah, thank you, Chip. No, just a thank you for everyone who attended. Thank you, Chip, for moderating this last session, and to Vincent, Bryce, and Detective Morgan for lots of thought-provoking, interesting information to share around technology, artificial intelligence. I'm in the same boat as Kim. My head hurts, but it's a good reason for my head to be hurting. So we did put in the chat some information related to providing feedback to us today for the sessions. We'd love to hear from you on what you found useful, ways we can improve upon this moving forward in the future. And certainly if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. But thank you all for attending, and we hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.